Hello. Are you ready for a brain? Ta-da! See that? Um, the way we're going to start off with things is we're going to first take a look at the vascular supply for the brain. We're going to be looking at the arteries that serve the brain. And so I'm going to use this brain. It's been injected, which means that you can see where the arteries are because the pink latex is in them. And this one is nicely stained. I'll show you another one that's also nice, but it just picks up more detail. This one just plainly shows the main arteries. And you can probably notice that there's a pair that's going off here, there's some here, some going down here. And you know, one thing I'll point out here, do you see that there's this kind of circle of arteries? And that's called the circle of Willis. And that allows for redundant blood supply, so that if, for instance, there would be some sort of lack of blood flow through this area, that it could be made up for by the blood going all around this area to get to, for instance, that. So if there were to be some sort of clot, it can be made up for with this redundant flow. The blood vessels that serve the circle of Willis are the vertebral artery and the carotid. Now, I can't really show you the carotid. It comes in here. You can see that there's a little bit of a stub right there, a little bit right there. But in order for you to me to be able to show you the brain, I have to remove the tissue that's on top of all this, and then I'm removing the carotid invariably from that. But that would be feeding in here. And then I'll point out the vertebral artery. It's a little bit lower on the brain, and we're too zoomed in right now. But let's take a look at these arteries that serve the major parts of the cerebrum. There's a pair of arteries right here, and you can see that these are the anterior. Zoom back a little bit just so you can kind of get a sense of where we are. This is the anterior end of the brain. This is where the spinal cord is coming in. So this is the anterior cerebral artery. This is called the middle cerebral artery. This one on the right side, the right side of the brain, left one here. And then this is the posterior cerebral artery. I'm going to get my other glove on so I can tilt the brain and point. It's coming up here. It needs to go to the cerebrum, which is this. So these ones that are going down to the cerebellum, no, but this one here, posterior cerebral artery. Okay, let's take a look here. Again, there's that circle of Willis, but then there's this. This is the basilar artery, and it's right there along the base of the brain. And this basilar artery gets served by the vertebral arteries, left and right, that come together to serve it. I can zoom in there, but for this brain, the vertebral artery can't quite see the left and rightness of it. I'll bring in this other brain. You see this one's injected more. One nice thing that you can a little bit more clearly see, this and this, those are the spots. You kind of see like a bright pink circle, a little dot there. That's where the carotid is coming in. You can see anterior and middle and posterior, but you see a lot of other little tiny branches. This is the basilar artery. And then looking here, you can see that there is a left and a right of the vertebral or vertebral arteries. Those are the ones that go through the transverse foramens in the cervical vertebra and come up. So those are some main blood vessels. All right, so before we dissect anything, I just want to show you what the sheep brain looks like without really doing anything to it. This is what it would look like if it was removed from the cranial case, and it has all of the meninges on it. And so the dura mater is what you see on here, and you can see that in some areas the dura is very, very thick. We'll talk about these areas in a second. And if you turn it over, you can see that there's little places where things are sticking out. We're going to be learning some of the cranial nerves. Now, there's 12 of them, and once you get beyond number 6 on a sheep brain, it's hard to be able to identify the ones that are of higher numbers. They're very small little threads. And you might think even some of the ones within 1 to 6 are pretty small little threads, but they are pretty distinctive in where they are, and so we can identify those. You might notice this kind of bump dangling down. Yeah, the pituitary is in there. This kind of big branchy thing is one big part, one big cranial nerve, and it's branches. That's the trigeminal. But we'll be looking at these in some more detail. But what that requires is to cut some of the dura off. And what I'll first do is I'll cut some dura mater off, and then I'll show you some structures that are associated with the dura. Okay. So what I've done is I've removed some of the dura on one side here, and what you're seeing now with the dura removed is, in terms of meninges, a combination of arachnoid layer and pia mater layer. The arachnoid layer has a lot of vascularization associated with them. There isn't any staining that goes on with these brains, and so you end up just with a kind of a purplish brownish color that tells you where some of the vascularization was. And you can see that there's this big region. This is cerebrum, and this region is kind of coming out the back here, and this is the cerebellum. But notice that there are these thick areas of dura, and there's this thick area that separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And that wall of dura is called the tentorium cerebelli. I know, it seems like a weird word. And it's not easy to spell, but don't blame me. But that helps provide some structure. It helps with being able to, if there were to be injury, trauma to the skull, that these big main structures aren't going to be rattled around as much or bumping into each other. And also there is this big kind of wall of dura mater, and that goes between the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. I'm going to cut a little bit more off here, and I just want you to be able to kind of look down and be able to see this wall. And that's called the falx cerebri. Again, it's not easy to say these words. Now, within this, I'm going to cut some right here. you were going to see the sinus where the cerebrospinal fluid gets reabsorbed. You see how I've cut, and I think I'll zoom a bit more. And you can see that there's an opening right there. And that is the sagittal sinus. And the cerebral spinal fluid goes into that sinus and then gets eventually absorbed back into the blood. Okay, welcome back. I'm going to stay zoomed in here. And now I've removed just about all of the dura from the top here. There's a little bit all along the bottom. And so now we can get a better idea of what some of these areas of the brain look like. Here, going to be dividing the left and the right hemispheres here. And there's a whole nice view of the cerebellum. You can even see some spinal cord coming in here. And like I said, the surface here is covered with a combination of arachnoid and pia mater layer, and you really can't separate the two. I wouldn't be able to come here and then just remove the arachnoid without removing the pia mater layer. So in terms of dissection, this is the way we'll see it, as this kind of combination of the two. Now, there's going to be structures that you will learn on the whole brain, like this. And then there are structures that you will learn on the half brain, the sagittal section. And there are some structures that you can see in both cases. And so just note that in your handout there's a W next to some terms, there's an S next to some terms, and sometimes there's both a W and an S, because you can see them both ways. Now, with the whole brain, this is one way to take a look at some midbrain structures. So I'm taking a look at the posterior view of the brain here. Here's the cerebellum, and I'm going to push it down. And then you can see something in there. Doesn't that look like a butt? Doesn't that look like a butt? It's not just me. So, see, this looks like a butt. And then a student pointed out in the past, it looks like a butt on a toilet seat, you know, as if you're looking at it from behind. Whoever sees that. But anyway, that helps you be able to identify some structures. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. See the butt? This thing that looks like a butt is the superior colliculus. It's associated with vision. I'll talk about it in lecture. And then this is the inferior colliculus here, the thing that looks like the toilet seat. And then if you notice, if you just kind of lift this up a little bit, there's even something sticking out there. And that is the pineal. The pineal, now I don't have it as something that you can really see on the whole brain. We'll really see it in the sagittal section, but some ways, you know, if you just kind of angle it right, you can see the pineal that way. All right, so now I'm looking at the underside of the brain, and it has dura mater still on it, but there's a little bit of a cut here, and you can lift some away, and you can see some structures, and you can actually see some cranial nerves. You know, before I get to the little ones, I will point out the very big, obvious ones. And I'll start here. And where this kind of creamy material is coming through the dura mater right there, that is the olfactory nerve. And it also leads into an olfactory bulb, but we could just call it the olfactory nerve. And then that's the first cranial nerve. The second one here, you can kind of see that there's this branching to the left and the right. Very, very obvious. That is optic. So that's the second cranial nerve. There he is. And that's an obvious one. And then I'll mention here again the trigeminal. You see this kind of big, kind of arching branch. Now there's some fat associated with this, but do you see this big arching branch? And you go on the other side, you see this big thing that's kind of arching out. It's got some dura on it. And that's the trigeminal nerve, that's cranial nerve number 5. And then you'll notice in between that, there's this bumpy structure. It's not a cranial nerve, but that's the pituitary. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push some of this dura mater to the side, and you should see this nerve kind of very obviously there. This is the highest number that will go for the cranial nerves. This is cranial nerve number 6. This is abducens. This is one of the 3 cranial nerves that we'll be learning here that move eye muscles. So the abducens move some of these eye muscles. And then if I push this over, and you see this structure that I'm lifting up. This is another cranial nerve. This is nerve number 3. So we've already learned 1, 2, 3. This third one is ocular motor. That one, probably not surprisingly to you, is also involved with moving the eye. It controls quite a few eye muscles. This is the other one on the other side. So that kind of sticks out as maybe being slightly, I don't know, brighter in color, a little bit lighter in color than some of the other things. Then we know trigeminal and we know abducens. So already we know 5 of these 6 cranial nerves. Now we just need to find number 4. And number 4 is one of the tougher ones to find, but it is in a very distinctive area. In fact, I haven't even made sure whether you can easily see it in this brain or not. What I'm looking at here is this groove between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. You see how there's this kind of little ditchy spot. Oh, I see it. Okay. So it's right here. Okay, wait a minute. I'm going to look on the other side too. It's a little thready guy here between these. Let's take a look over here. Oh, you know what? Do you see this? That's the base of the trigeminal. And that's good to see. And invariably, when you take the dura mater off of these, this rips up. Even though it's so big and obvious, it can be pulled up, and then you really don't have any evidence of it anymore because it so easily, just as a whole big unit, rips away from the brain during these dissections. Not in real life, obviously. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use some scissors. I'm going to cut the dura mater off of this stub so you can see where this arises. There's a little bit of abducens. There's the other abducens. Those are nice to see. And then I'll show you some other anatomy too. Okay, and taking a look in here, you can see, again, this is where the abducens number 6 is. This guy and this guy. I'm going to zoom in even more. So those are lifted up. There's trigeminal now. So I've cut this down. I'm kind of lifting that whole trunk of it up. But as we know, that it is a big branch, but it kind of gets in the way. So there's the little bit of the trigeminal, and then here, kind of sticking up here in, again, that groove between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, in here, just a kind of a little thready guy. This is the fourth cranial nerve, called the trochlear nerve, and then that's the last of the ones that are involved with moving eye muscles. So it was ocular motor, number 3, trochlear, number 4, and abducens, number 6. Those all collectively help move different muscles of the eye. And now that I've removed some things, so I removed that pituitary, I'm going to cut away this other bit of trigeminal as well. And so now we can see some other anatomy that's on this whole brain. Let's go from the bottom here. We've got the spinal cord coming in, and then you can see this very distinctive bump and the start of the brain. So this, where it kind of first starts to swell out, this is the medulla, or called the medulla oblongata. And then you see another kind of bump here. Maybe it looks like a butt too. I don't know. You might see a lot of butts. This looks like it's kind of sitting on top of the medulla there. This is the pons. So there's the pons. And then arising off of that is an area of the midbrain. This is called the cerebral peduncle. The third cranial nerve, ocular motor, is arising off of that area. And then we see this, kind of poking at you too. A little bit lighter than some of the things around it. And this is the area where the pituitary had been. The pituitary had been just sitting right here. And now we've taken away, and now we see this. This is the hypothalamus. And you're probably aware of the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And so this is that area that helps control what hormones the pituitary releases. And I thought I'd show you just a little bit of some variety in regards to the cranial nerves. This is olfactory again. Maybe this is a better look at it. It's kind of has a nice flap to it. You get more of the optic here on one side. These are trigeminals that are sticking up at you. Again, you've seen them from the side. Oh, there's a nice pons. There's the pituitary. Here's the abducens again. The bottom of the abducens is always right there at that crease between the medulla and the pons. Oh, there's another trochlear. I'll zoom in on that. So there's that trochlear nerve. It's being stretched by me pushing up on the dura there. So that's number 4. Number 3. I have to cut a little bit more. But 3 is this one here. That now is in front of my probe. So getting a second look at all of these. Okay, so that's a lot of the whole brain structures, and when we do the half brain, we'll make a sagittal section. So we cut right down between the left and right hemispheres. There's this gap between the hemispheres called the longitudinal fissure. Another whole brain structure I'm thinking of that you can see here, the central canal. See that? There's the spinal cord, and you can see that nice opening right there. That's the central canal within the spinal cord, and cerebral spinal fluid flows in that as well. All right, hello again. And now we are taking a look at a sagittal section. This is brain that's been cut sagittally right down the longitudinal fissure, and you see something that looks like this. And this brain, when it was cut, the pituitary was still attached to it, so you actually see that kind of dangling down. You might not always get that on every half brain, but in this one you do. Oh, and you also even get a sense of the sagittal sinus from the side, which is kind of neat. All right. Now, let's identify some structures, and we can start with some of the obvious ones, the ones that we know already, and that includes like this big old thing is cerebellum. It even has this neat coloration difference. It's not very colorful, obviously, but it's just going to be shades of gray and white, but you see that there's this white matter that's on the inside, and then this kind of almost look like little leaves. It's even called the tree of life, or arbor vitae, this white matter pattern that you see in the cerebellum. So there's that. This is the cerebrum, not surprisingly, all of that. The pituitary. Here, somewhat artificially big here, but this is the central canal coming in of the spinal cord, but then you see this bump here of the start of the brain, and there's the medulla. So here's the medulla coming here. Then you see that second bump, and there's the pons again. And then this is a structure that's pretty obvious, but this is new. We couldn't see this on the outside. This is the thalamus. So this it's somewhat like a half circle here, makes this big round area. So thalamus is there. So this area between the pons and the thalamus gets called cerebral peduncle, and that's what we had also seen on the outside, and the third cranial nerve came from there. Near the thalamus here is the pineal. And the pineal is near these two structures, and we had seen these three all together when we were first starting to look at some of the whole brain structures. This is the superior colliculus, remember the butt? And then here's the inferior colliculus, the thing that kind of looked like a toilet seat. So there's the superior, inferior colliculus, and there's the pineal that's nearby. I'm going to switch to another brain to show you one structure that just ends up being better on this brain. But here's the pineal again. There's the thalamus. But below the thalamus, there's this little structure here. Again, here's pons. There's cerebral peduncle. This is the hypothalamus. So hypo, below, thalamus. So hypothalamus. It makes sense. It's often a slightly little bit whiter area. It sometimes gets confused with it, even though it's a bit anterior to it and is pretty thick and obvious. This is the optic chiasm. This was that crossover point where the optic nerves cross over. Okay. Then there's also some this connecting structure here, and this is fairly white compared to some of the other anatomy around it. This is the corpus callosum, and that is a band of axons that connects the left and right cerebral hemispheres. This, just below that, You see this opening here I'm poking into? This is one of the ventricles. So I teach about these in lecture. And this is the very big and most obvious of the ventricles. This is called the lateral ventricle. There's quite more to it as you go laterally. We aren't going to be able to see that with the sagittal dissection, but we can see kind of the most medial part of it there. And so that's lateral ventricle. And then here, just above this thalamus here, this groove, that's where the third ventricle is. So this is the third ventricle. There's actually a little bit of a tiny groove that helps make this look like a circle. That's all third ventricle. Then there is a canal here, which looks quite nice. It's called the cerebral aqueduct, like a little tunnel for cerebral spinal fluid. Remember that the cerebral spinal fluid is flowing in all of these ventricles. Well, it's being produced there. In fact, if I just kind of drag out some tissue here that's in the lateral ventricle, do you see how it's kind of reddish? Amongst all the colors, you know, it's not bright red, but it's reddish compared to some of these other things. That's some choroid plexus tissue. So that's where cerebral spinal fluid is indeed produced, on the lining of these ventricles. So there was some choroid plexus in that lateral ventricle. There's third. Here's this little connecting cerebral aqueduct. And then the fourth ventricle is underneath here. So there again is the cerebellum. There's again that arbor vitae kind of pattern. And then there's a bit of a groove, a little bit of a space. So a ventricle is always going to be a space somewhere. And this space is between the fourth ventricle and this kind of area where there's a little bit of medulla and there's a little bit of pons. So in this area, where it's medulla or pons. Okay, I'll stop for now. Make sure I covered everything. Okay, I saw that I did indeed cover everything. So I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the lab, and you'll be able to look at this stuff. We'll see you.